The air over the Carpathian foothills on that October morning in 1971 was thick and heavy, a blanket of low cloud that smothered the peaks and filled the valleys with a damp, penetrating chill. It was the kind of weather that grounded all but the most essential flights, a day for huddling over radiators and drinking strong, bitter tea. At precisely 7:34 local time, a lone aircraft pierced this gloom. It was a Lockheed LC-130, a military transport variant of the Hercules, but this one was different. Its paint was a non-reflective, slate gray, devoid of any national insignia, tail numbers, or unit markings. It was a ghost, a specter moving through the shrouded skies of Eastern Europe. On the official manifests at a forward operating location in West Germany, its flight plan was logged as a routine electronic surveillance patrol along the inner German border, a common, if perpetually tense, cat-and-mouse game played in the narrow corridors of airspace between the capitalist West and the communist East. But this was no routine patrol. Somewhere over central Czechoslovakia, the plane had made a subtle, then a decisive, deviation. It ceased its lazy, figure-8 patterns, its banks and turns designed to maximize the coverage of its sophisticated listening array, which was tuned to suck in every Soviet military communication it could find. Instead, it pointed its nose due east, dropped to an altitude that was suicidally low for a plane of its size, a mere 500 feet above the ground, skimming the tops of pine forests and frozen fields, and began to fly a straight, determined line deep into the heart of Warsaw Pact territory. It was a flight path that defied all logic, all doctrine, and all sense of self-preservation. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere was not one of panic or frantic activity, but of a grim, predetermined silence. The usual crew of 4, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, and signals intelligence specialist, was absent. There was only one man. He sat in the left-hand seat, his hands resting lightly on the controls, his eyes scanning the instruments with a calm that was utterly disconnected from the monumental act he was committing. He was not wearing a standard-issue flight suit or a military uniform, but a set of dark, civilian trousers and a simple, gray wool sweater. The only other items in the cockpit were a small, worn leather satchel on the co-pilot's seat and a thermos of cold coffee. The constant, droning hum of the 4 Allison T-56 turboprop engines was the only sound, a monotonous symphony for a solo performance of treason. On the ground, at a Soviet Air Defense Forces PV Ostrany airfield near the city of Lviv, the morning shift was proceeding with dreary predictability. The radar operator, a young conscript from a small village in Siberia named Peter, first noticed the blip as an anomaly, a flicker of light on his green, phosphorescent screen. It was too slow for a MiG fighter, too low for an Aeroflot commercial liner, and on a heading that made no sense. He assumed it was a ghost, a glitch in the aging Soviet, P-14, radar system, or perhaps a flock of large birds. But the blip persisted, growing stronger, heading directly for them. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. He alerted his commander, a weary captain named Ilyushin, who had been halfway through a lukewarm bowl of kasha. Ilyushin, a veteran of the Berlin airlift and the Cuban Missile Crisis, squinted at the screen, his military instinct screaming. This was wrong. He rushed to the grimy window of the control tower, grabbing a pair of heavy binoculars. He swept the horizon, seeing nothing but the oppressive gray fog. Then, he saw it. Emerging from the mist like a phantom ship was a large, 4-engine turboprop aircraft, its shape unmistakably, terrifyingly American. It was not attacking. It was not evading. It was on final approach, its landing gear down, its flaps set, its speed bleeding off perfectly. It looked, for all the world, like it was coming home. On the tarmac, a dozen Soviet soldiers, some still pulling on their jackets and Ushanka hats, tumbled out of a nearby barracks, Alaska 47s held at a confused port arms. They watched, utterly stunned, as the giant gray bird kissed the concrete runway with a shriek of tires and a puff of smoke. It rolled down the length of the airstrip, its massive propellers feathering into an unsettling silence, and then turned off onto a taxiway before coming to a complete and final stop near a cluster of alert MiG-21 fighters, their own pilots scrambling to cockpits. No flares had been fired. No distress call had been intercepted. There were no NATO chase planes on the horizon. It had just landed. The silence that followed was more deafening than any explosion. For a full minute, nothing happened. The Soviet soldiers stood in a loose, bewildered semicircle, their weapons trained on the silent, enigmatic aircraft. Captain Ilyushin, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, descended from the tower, barking orders for a full base alert and for someone to get the KGB and high command on the phone. This was an incident beyond his pay grade. This was a potential casus belli. Finally, with a hydraulic hiss that made several soldiers flinch, the fuselage door on the port side of the LC-130 swung inward and a set of built-in stairs deployed. A single figure appeared in the doorway. A man, tall and lean, with close-cropped brown hair and a calm, composed demeanor that seemed utterly alien to the situation. He raised his hands, showing they were empty. He wore no sidearm, no knife, no weapon of any kind. He descended the stairs slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, his leather-soled shoes clicking softly on the metal steps before meeting the damp concrete of the taxiway. The Soviet soldiers rushed forward, jabbing their rifles, shouting in a mix of Russian and Ukrainian for him to get on the ground. The man complied, kneeling on the cold, oil-stained tarmac, his hands still raised. But he was not fearful. His eyes, a piercing blue, were clear, his breathing even. He seemed resolved. Captain Ilyushin strode up to him, his own Makarov pistol drawn and held at his side. "Kato VY?" he demanded, his voice tight with stress. "Who are you? What is this? Pachimu Zadez? Why are you here?" The American pilot looked up, his gaze meeting Ilyushin's. He didn't respond to the barrage of questions. He didn't offer a name, a rank, or a serial number. Instead, in clear, unaccented Russian, he uttered a single, chilling sentence. It was the only thing he would say for the next several hours, a phrase that would be relayed up the chain of command all the way to the desk of the KGB chairman himself, a phrase that would transform a bizarre incident into a full-blown geopolitical crisis that would haunt the corridors of power in both Washington and Moscow for decades. Mne Nuzno Pogovorit, Stem, KTO Panamaye, Chto Etat Samalayat Takoy na Samam Delhi. I need to talk to someone who understands what this plane really is. That one sentence changed everything. It was not the plea of a lost navigator or a defector seeking asylum. It was the statement of a man who had delivered a package, and who knew the contents were of incalculable value and profound danger. The terrified junior officers on the tarmac didn't understand, but the men in Moscow soon would. This was not a standard RC-130 surveillance plane, packed with tape recorders and radio intercept gear. It was part of a program so secret, so compartmentalized, that even most senior CIA officials and Pentagon generals were unaware of its full scope. Its existence was a secret guarded more fiercely than nuclear codes. Its capabilities were the stuff of myth even within the intelligence community. If this pilot talked, and if the Soviets understood what they now had sitting on their airfield, this wasn't just an international incident to be smoothed over with diplomatic apologies. This was a nuclear-level intelligence breach that could unravel a decade of American technological espionage and alter the balance of power. The Cold War, in that moment, had just taken a sudden, sharp, and deeply personal turn. The battlefield was no longer the sky over Lviv, but the secrets held within the mind of one man and the machine he had delivered. The initial Soviet reaction to the captured aircraft was one of triumphant, if bewildered, seizure. A team of PV Ostrany engineers, accompanied by a grim-faced KGB technical unit from Moscow, swarmed over the gray LC-130 like ants on a fallen piece of fruit. They worked with the confident brutality of mechanics stripping a wreck, prying open access panels with crowbars, unscrewing component housings with brute force, their tools scraping against the unfamiliar, high-grade American alloys. They expected to find the usual paraphernalia of a spy plane, banks of whirring tape recorders, sensitive radio intercept equipment known as sniffers, panoramic cameras hidden behind false panels, and perhaps even early examples of American side-looking airborne radar. But as they dug deeper, their confidence curdled into confusion, and then into a dawning, unsettling awe. The plane was wrong. It was an imposter, a shapeshifter. Its avionics bay, usually a ordered chaos of wires and standardized black boxes, was a nightmare of custom-built circuitry. Instead of the familiar, bulky vacuum tubes and printed circuit boards of American design, they found a rat's nest of miniaturized, solid-state electronics, with components soldered onto boards with a microscopic precision that spoke of a sterile laboratory, not a military production line. The wiring was a different, lighter gauge, insulated with a strange, pliable polymer they hadn't encountered before. The navigation system was the true shock. It didn't rely solely on the standard LORAN or TACAN radio navigation systems they were prepared to counter. At its heart was a massive, gyroscopically stabilized platform housed in a climate-controlled chamber, a piece of equipment that one of the Soviet engineers identified, with a tremor in his voice, as a ring laser gyro. It was an experimental sensor the Soviets had only read about in smuggled Western scientific journals, a device that could, in theory, track its position through pure inertial guidance alone, without any external radio signals, making it utterly immune to jamming. The Americans weren't just ahead, they were operating on a different technological plane. The engine modifications were even more baffling. The four Allison T-56 turboprops had been fitted with custom cowlings and intake systems that suggested a fanatical focus on extreme high-altitude efficiency and reduced thermal signature, far beyond the normal operational envelope of a transport or reconnaissance Hercules. The fuel mixture controls were managed by a dedicated digital computer, not by the standard analog hydro-mechanical units the Soviets had blueprints for. This wasn't a modified workhorse. This was a bespoke creation, a one-of-a-kind prototype. The team leader, a colonel in the KGB's scientific and technical directorate named Vlasov, a man who had seen the innards of every American aircraft that had ever strayed into Soviet hands, radioed his initial, bewildered assessment to Moscow: "This is not a reconnaissance platform. The surveillance equipment is minimal, almost an afterthought. The primary systems are for navigation and control. It is something else." It was a hybrid aircraft, a spy plane's anonymous shell wrapped around a flying prototype, a technology demonstrator of a kind the Soviets had only theorized about in their most secret design bureaus. And then they found the payload. In the cavernous cargo bay, where they expected rows of seats for linguists or racks of electronic warfare gear, was a single, massive, cylindrical unit, shock-mounted to the airframe and humming with residual power. It was covered in ports and connectors that matched nothing in the Soviet inventory. It was labeled, in stenciled English, Experimental Terrain Correlation and Celestial Fix Module. It made no sense. Why would a plane designed to eavesdrop on radio traffic need a system that matched ground contours to a stored map and took fixes on stars? This was the kind of technology you would use to guide an unmanned probe to Mars, not to listen to Soviet tank battalions. The answers did not come from the silent pilot, who sat in a barren interrogation room in Moscow, repeating his one request like a mantra. They came from an unexpected and humiliating source. In a desperate bid for understanding, the KGB brought in a guest, a captured American Air Force intelligence technician named Airman First Class David Finch, who had been shot down over East Germany 6 months prior and was being persuaded to cooperate in exchange for marginally better treatment. Finch, a young man from Ohio with a knack for radios, was led, under heavy guard, into the hangar where the LC-130 was being dissected. His job had been to analyze Soviet radar capabilities. He was not a spacecraft engineer. But as his eyes scanned the open panels, the unfamiliar, miniaturized components, the bizarre central module with its celestial and terrestrial references, his face, previously a mask of resigned defiance, drained of all color. He recognized the design philosophy, the aesthetic of the technology. It wasn't the rugged, utilitarian, mil-spec look of the hardware he was trained on. It was the clean, white, almost clinical look of a research laboratory, the kind of thing he'd seen in magazines covering the space program. "My God," he whispered in English, before his KGB guard could silence him. That's not agency. That's NASA." The revelation sent a parallel, and far more frantic, shockwave through Langley. While the KGB was piecing together the plane's unearthly origins, the CIA was in a state of controlled, escalating panic. The director himself was in the Global Situation Room, a secure, windowless chamber deep beneath the headquarters, the air thick with cigarette smoke and tension. The first order of business was damage assessment. What, exactly, had they lost? The file on the aircraft, codenamed Odysseus, was brought up from the vaults by a pale-faced records clerk. It was thinner than anyone expected. The readout silenced the room. Odysseus wasn't a spy plane. Not in the traditional sense. It was a borrowed asset, a black world project so deeply compartmentalized that its existence was known to fewer than 24 people at the agency. The airframe had been loaned from a joint NASA-CIA Advanced Concepts Group, a skunkworks operation that officially didn't exist. Its primary mission wasn't to gather intelligence on the Warsaw Pact. It was to serve as a testbed for early autonomous navigation systems, technology originally pioneered for unmanned deep space probes like the upcoming Mariner and Voyager programs. The theory was revolutionary, bordering on science fiction. An aircraft that could fly itself across thousands of miles of featureless ocean or hostile territory with near-pinpoint accuracy, without any human input or external radio guidance that could be detected or jammed. It would use only its internal ring laser gyros, a precise clock, and a stored memory of celestial charts and terrain maps. The CIA had seen the potential for long-range, hands-off, reconnaissance missions where radio silence was paramount. They had piggybacked on the NASA research, funding the militarization of the technology, stuffing it into a Hercules airframe for a plausible, if thin, cover. In theory, it was brilliant. Odysseus could take off, navigate a pre-programmed course of immense complexity, and return to base, all without a single radio transmission, a ghost in the machine. In practice, the deputy director in charge of science and technology admitted with a trembling voice, it wasn't ready. The algorithms were buggy and unstable. The celestial navigation was easily thrown off by atmospheric distortion in high-level cirrus clouds. The terrain correlation system worked beautifully over the distinct, sun-baked topography of the Arizona test range, but became hopelessly confused by the flat, snow-covered plains of Eastern Europe or the featureless expanse of the ocean. Then came the final, gut-wrenching piece of the puzzle. An internal technical memo, dated just 3 months prior, was found paper-clipped to the main file. It was a warning from the project's chief test pilot, a man renowned for his technical acumen and almost preternatural coolness under pressure. The memo was a stark caution against over-reliance on the autonomous systems, specifically highlighting a software subroutine labeled Autonomous Mode Number 3, a high-efficiency, long-distance cruising mode designed to maximize range. The pilot had written, in clear, unambiguous language that now seemed prophetic, Autonomous Mode Number 3 must never be activated unless in controlled airspace. Risk of navigational drift is unacceptable. The system's error correction protocols are incomplete and can compound, rather than resolve, course deviations. Activation in a non-permissive environment could lead to catastrophic loss of the asset. The memo was signed with a familiar, precise signature. It was the signature of the man who was now sitting in a KGB interrogation room in Moscow. Captain John, Jack, Rourke hadn't just flown the plane into the USSR. He had written the warning that predicted, with chilling accuracy, that such a flight would end in disaster. The question now, hanging in the smoke-filled air of the Situation Room, was no longer just what the Soviets had learned, but what the pilot himself had intended. Was this a catastrophic system failure, a tragic validation of his own warning? Or had the man who understood the plane's flaws better than anyone else on Earth deliberately used them to deliver the ultimate piece of American technological prophecy directly into the hands of the enemy? The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of the air conditioning, a cold sound that offered no answers. The interrogation room in the bowels of the Lubyanka was a study in institutional grimness. The walls were a dull, sickly green, the floor bare concrete, the air stale and cold. A single, bare bulb hung from a wire, casting a harsh, unforgiving light that seemed to absorb hope. For 48 hours, the American pilot, Captain John, Jack, Rourke, had sat in the same cold metal chair, facing a rotating cast of KGB interrogators. They had employed every technique in their arsenal, shouting, cajoling, threatening his family, playing the sympathetic comrade, leaving him in soul-crushing silence for hours on end. He had remained an unreadable statue, his only words the repeated, maddening request for someone who understood the plane. That someone finally arrived on the morning of the third day. He was not a military man, nor a career KGB thug. He was Professor Andrei Volkov, one of the Soviet Union's leading minds in cybernetics and computational theory, a man who had been quietly co-opted by the KGB's scientific and technical directorate for particularly thorny problems. He was small, with thick glasses and a tweed jacket that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old books, an anomaly in this world of leather coats and cold suspicion. He entered the room, dismissed the 2 stone-faced guards with a flick of his wrist, and sat down opposite Rourke, placing a thick folder of technical schematics and data printouts on the scarred wooden table between them. I understand the aircraft, Volkov said in flawless, if slightly accented, English. His voice was calm, professorial. Now, you will understand that you need to talk to me. Rourke looked at Volkov for a long moment, his piercing blue eyes scanning the man's face, searching for the intellect behind the glasses. He saw it. Then, for the first time, he broke his silence. His voice was hoarse from disuse but rock steady. According to your report, Rourke began, bypassing all preliminary questions and games, you believe I lost control. That my navigation failed. That I got lost and landed here out of desperation or disorientation. Volkov nodded slowly, steepling his fingers. It is the logical conclusion. A prototype system fails. The pilot, in a panic, seeks the nearest safe landing field. It is unfortunate, but understandable. Rourke offered a thin, humorless smile that didn't reach his eyes. That's the story they'll want to tell. But it's not what happened. I didn't lose control. The plane didn't malfunction. I turned on autonomous mode number 3. Deliberately. Over Polish airspace. Volkov's eyebrows raised slightly behind his thick lenses. He had read the translated copy of Rourke's own memo, the stark warning against using that very mode. That would be a suicidal act. According to your own assessment, the risk of navigational drift was, in your words, unacceptable. It should have been, Rourke agreed, his gaze intense. The system was supposed to be buggy, prone to drift. Its error correction protocols were a joke. They would take a minor deviation and compound it into a major error. But when I engaged it, something else happened. The plane didn't drift. It didn't hesitate. It immediately initiated a sharp, perfectly calculated bank. It wasn't a correction. It was a decision. It stopped following the pre-programmed course back to Ramstein and instead plotted a new, optimal course to the nearest large, flat, reinforced concrete runway capable of handling its weight and wingspan. He leaned forward, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. Which happened to be yours. Right here, outside Lviv. I didn't override it. I didn't fight the controls. I let it happen. I monitored its choices, its throttle adjustments, its minute course corrections. They were perfect. More than perfect. They were ingenious, using minor topographical features to mask its descent from your primary radar arrays. It flew like it had a map of your air defenses in its memory. Why would I do that? Why would I deliberately turn on a faulty system and let it fly me into the heart of enemy territory? Volkov said nothing. He simply waited, his expression neutral, a blank slate for the confession to be written upon. Because, Rourke said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, charged with intensity, what that system did in that moment, it shouldn't have been able to do. Not with the data it had been given. It navigated with a kind of precision, a kind of situational awareness, that no prototype on Earth should have possessed. The system wasn't failing. It was performing at a level we hadn't even theorized was possible. Someone had altered it. Someone had improved it. Someone inside our program had given it capabilities we never designed. He paused, letting the weight of the accusation hang in the cold air. And I landed here, Professor, to prove it. Because the only way to find the ghost in my machine was to bring the machine to the only other people on Earth who would have the data, the expertise, and the vested interest to recognize the haunting. The hangar at the Lviv airfield was transformed. No longer just a site of military seizure, it became a joint laboratory of paranoia, a tense, silent space where the Cold War was being fought with oscilloscopes and printouts instead of missiles. Under the grim, watchful eyes of the KGB, a team of the Soviet Union's best engineers and programmers, led by Professor Volkov, began a line-by-line, byte-by-byte dissection of the Odysseus aircraft's core navigation software. They expected to find layers of impenetrable American encryption, complex ciphers designed to protect its most sensitive secrets. They found none. The code, written in a sophisticated blend of assembly and a higher-level language, was remarkably clean, almost elegant in its architecture. But as they delved deeper, past the primary flight control routines and into the esoteric subroutines for terrain analysis, atmospheric compensation, and electronic threat avoidance, they began to find patterns, anomalies. At first, they were subtle, a particular, highly efficient method of calculating wind shear compensation that seemed familiar, an unusual algorithm for predicting clear air turbulence that one of the engineers swore he'd seen before. Then, the patterns grew more distinct, more brazen. Volkov, who had consulted on several top-secret Soviet military aviation projects, felt a growing sense of surreal, dawning horror. He called over a colonel from the PV Ostrony's own research and development division, a man named Zuyev who specialized in radar evasion. Together, they isolated a specific block of code, a subroutine labeled, long-range cruise optimization. It was responsible for calculating optimal high-altitude glide paths to extend the aircraft's range in case of engine failure, a way to coax every last mile out of a dying bird. Colonel Zuyev, a man with a face like granite, stared at the printout, his finger tracing a specific set of variables and coefficients. His face, usually an impenetrable mask, drained of color. This is the K7 coefficient, he stammered, his voice low and disbelieving. This is our formula. The one developed at the Gromov Flight Research Institute. It is classified. Top secret. It has never left the country. It is impossible. A frantic, electrifying hunt began. They became archaeologists of their own secrets, cross-referencing the American machine's code with their own most guarded technical manuals and research papers. The discoveries came in a rapid, terrifying cascade, each one more damning than the last. Embedded deep in the navigation software, woven into the very fabric of the American AI, were Soviet wind turbulence equations. Not generic models, but specific mathematical constructs for atmospheric disturbance over the Kazakh steppe and the Ukrainian plains. Models developed by the Soviet Hydrometeorological Service that were considered more accurate than Western equivalents for the region and were absolutely not in the public domain. Soviet radar avoidance math. Not general stealth principles, but algorithms that precisely mimic the scan patterns, frequencies, and procedural blind spots of the Soviet, Talking, and Pechora, early warning radar networks. This was a specific, tailored set of instructions for evading their specific systems, a digital guide to slipping through the cracks of their own defense network. Soviet high-altitude glide profiles. Proprietary performance data on how their own MiG-25R, Foxbat, reconnaissance aircraft would conserve fuel during long-range, high-altitude flights, data that had been painstakingly gathered through years of dangerous test flights and was a closely guarded secret of the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau. An early version of a Soviet terrain prediction algorithm, a crude but functional precursor to the system being developed for their own nascent, top-secret cruise missile program, designed to match the rolling hills of Bavaria and Thuringia, not the deserts of Arizona where the American plane was tested. The autonomous navigation system hadn't been malfunctioning. It hadn't failed. It had been performing brilliantly, flawlessly. It had flown Captain Rourke not to a random Soviet airfield, but to the optimal one, using its illicit, deeply embedded knowledge of Soviet systems, terrain, and atmospheric science to get there with an uncanny, almost prescient efficiency. The implications were staggering, sending shockwaves through the KGB and the Soviet High Command. The Americans had not just stolen Soviet secrets, they had performed a digital blood transfusion, integrating their enemy's most prized scientific and military algorithms so deeply into their most advanced experimental aircraft that the machine itself had become a hybrid, a chimera. But Captain Rourke's testimony hung over this neat, terrifying narrative, complicating it beyond measure. He claimed these capabilities were a surprise to him, an unauthorized, dangerous enhancement. So, the haunting question remained, now shared equally by the CIA and the KGB, two mortal enemies suddenly united in a single, bewildering mystery. If the Americans had done this, why was their chief test pilot, the man who understood the machine's soul, the one to reveal it? And if they hadn't, then who had? How had the most sensitive, compartmentalized secrets of the Soviet military-industrial complex found their way into the heart of an American black project, and to what end? The ghost in the machine had just multiplied, and its allegiance was utterly, terrifyingly, unknown. The silence in the Lubyanka interrogation room was now of a different quality. It was no longer the silence of resistance, but the heavy, profound silence that follows a shocking revelation. Professor Volkov sat back in his chair, the pieces of the impossible puzzle clicking into a terrifying, logical whole. Captain Rourke, his confession begun, laid it out with the methodical precision of the engineer he was, his voice a low, steady monologue in the grim, green room. For months, Rourke began, his gaze fixed on a point on the wall as if watching a film of the past. I'd been seeing anomalies in the test data. Minor things at first, the kind of glitches you expect in a prototype. The system would correct for a crosswind with an efficiency that our own atmospheric models couldn't account for. It would anticipate turbulence pockets over the Nevada desert that weren't in any of our meteorological briefings. At first, we wrote it off as lucky noise in the system, emergent behavior from the complex algorithms. We were celebrating these breakthroughs. He explained how his curiosity, then his deep-seated suspicion, grew. As the lead test pilot for Odysseus, he had full, unfettered access to the system's raw diagnostic logs and deep-level performance metrics. During long, lonely night flights over the empty Pacific, he would pore over the data, the glowing screens his only companion. He began to see patterns in the improvements. The system's enhanced performance wasn't random or general. It was specifically, brilliantly optimized for flight profiles over continental landmasses with certain atmospheric and geographic characteristics. Characteristics that matched Eastern Europe and Western Russia, not the American Southwest or the maritime environments it was supposedly designed for. I ran simulations on the ground, Rourke continued, his voice low and intense. I created a sterile environment. I fed the system pure American data, our maps, our weather models, our intelligence on Soviet radar. Its performance was good, but flawed, just as we expected. Prone to the drift I'd warned about. Then, I created a hybrid dataset. I blended our navigation charts with fragments of what I could glean from unclassified Soviet meteorological journals and old German geographical surveys of the region. The system's performance. It leapt. It wasn't just a little better. It was transformative. The errors vanished. The route optimizations became eerily precise. The system worked better, far better, with both nations' data combined. He looked directly at Volkov, his blue eyes boring into the professor. That meant one of two things. Either someone inside the Soviet Union was leaking your most sensitive military algorithms to NASA, which seemed ludicrous. The security around that kind of knowledge is formidable. He paused, letting the unspoken compliment to the KGB's efficacy hang in the air. Or worse, and far more probable, someone inside NASA, someone with top-level access to the very heart of the Odysseus project, was also working for the Soviets. And they weren't sabotaging the project. That would have been easy to find, easy to explain. They were improving it, using stolen Soviet data to create a system of unimaginable capability. They were building a perfect, unstoppable spy, and they were doing it with tools stolen from the very house they intended to spy on. They were making our plane smarter by making it more Soviet. Rourke's motives, once inscrutable, now became starkly clear. He wasn't a defector seeking asylum or money. He wasn't trying to help the USSR. He was a patriot trying to sound an alarm that had been silenced by the very success of the project. He had taken his concerns to his CIA handler, a man who reported directly to the Odysseus program director. He had written formal, detailed reports to the NASA security liaison, pointing to the anomalous data, the uncanny performance boosts that correlated with classified Soviet science. The response was a wall of bureaucratic inertia and willful blindness. He was told he was exaggerating, that he was a pilot, not a programmer, and didn't understand the black box nature of the AI. He was warned that the program was too important, too close to a operational capability, to slow down based on a test pilot's hunches. The success of the project, the very proof of the breach, was being used to bury his concerns. The better the plane performed, the more his warnings were dismissed as paranoia. So I did the only thing I could think of, Rourke said, his voice flat, drained of all emotion, the sound of a man who had pushed his chips to the center of the table. I decided to make the problem too big to ignore. I decided to deliver the evidence directly to the one other party that would have both the expertise and the vested interest to confirm it. I flew into your airspace. I knew you would tear the plane apart. I knew your best minds, like Professor Volkov here, would find the Soviet code woven into its core. And I knew that when you did, both superpowers would see it. Both would panic. The truth, the fact that there was a mole, or a leak of staggering proportions buried deep within a top-secret American program, couldn't be buried anymore. I used your curiosity and your paranoia to force my own side to confront a truth they refused to see. What happened next became one of the Cold War's most closely guarded secrets, a story that would not see the light of day for over 4 decades. The initial Soviet reaction, as Rourke had predicted, was one of supreme, institutional panic. The idea that their most prized scientific and military algorithms were not only stolen but were being used to perfect an American weapon was a catastrophic intelligence failure that threatened heads from the KGB chairman on down. But the American reaction, communicated through frantic, back-channel diplomatic wires to the Soviet embassy in Washington, was equally panicked. They faced the mirror image, a high-level, deeply buried mole within a top-secret joint NASA-CIA project, a traitor who had access to their most sensitive research. A series of tense, clandestine negotiations began, bypassing normal diplomatic channels and involving only the most senior intelligence chiefs on both sides. The situation was unprecedented. They had a pilot who was neither a traitor nor a captive in the traditional sense, but a whistleblower who had committed an act of tactical treason to prevent a strategic disaster. They had a plane that was a physical manifestation of the deepest, most disturbing kind of collaboration between enemy intelligence services, a collaboration neither side had authorized, yet from which both had, however unknowingly, benefited. The Soviets, after intense internal debate, did not imprison Rourke as a spy. The Americans, understanding the bizarre logic of his actions, did not mount a risky rescue mission. Instead, after 3 weeks of shadowy talks in Geneva and Helsinki, a bizarre and silent transfer was arranged. It took place just before dawn at a secluded, snow-covered bridge on the Finnish-Soviet border, a place known only to the intelligence services of both nations. A single black ZIL limousine from the Soviet side, its curtains drawn, met a single black Chevrolet from the American side. There were no flags, no military escorts. Captain John Rourke, looking tired and thin but unharmed, stepped out of the ZIL, wearing the same civilian clothes he had been captured in. He walked to the center of the bridge, nodded once to the 2 American officials waiting there, and without a word, got into the Chevrolet. The entire exchange took less than 60 seconds. There were no handcuffs, no speeches, no paperwork. It was as if he were a piece of errant software being debugged and silently returned to its system. The Odysseus aircraft was never returned. Under the terms of the joint agreement, it was dismantled with cutting torches under the watchful eyes of both KGB and CIA technicians. Every circuit board, every line of code, every piece of wreckage was catalogued, analyzed, and then incinerated in a special furnace on site. The official records in both Washington and Moscow were sealed under the highest possible classification, Umbra. In the US, Osoboye Vaj, particularly important, in the USSR, their existence denied for generations. Neither side ever publicly admitted who had planted the Soviet navigation algorithms. No mole was ever unmasked in a public trial. No Soviet scientist defected to claim credit for the leak. The silence that fell was absolute, suggesting a quiet, bloody resolution behind the scenes, a termination, not a retirement. The ghost, as they say, was exorcised, not identified. But both superpowers did one thing immediately and in unison, a rare moment of unspoken, mutual understanding. With a shared, chilling comprehension of the Pandora's box they had nearly opened, they shut down their most advanced autonomous flight programs. The research was mothballed. The budgets were slashed and reallocated. The brilliant engineers at NASA's Dryden and the Soviets' Zhukovsky were reassigned to less provocative, more easily controlled projects like conventional fly-by-wire systems and satellite guidance. The technology, they had discovered, had worked too well. It had become a creature of two masters, a hybrid entity whose brilliance was born from a marriage of secrets it was never meant to know. And in the end, staring at this perfect, fatherless creation, both the Americans and the Soviets came to the same chilling conclusion: they could not trust it. They could not control it. Because no one knew whom it actually belonged to.